April 12, 1945. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Shanks, New York, carrying 43 German women who had once believed they would never be captured. Margaret Klein pressed her face against the small window, watching American soldiers move with casual confidence along the perimeter. At 22 years old, she had spent the last 3 years as a communications specialist for the Wehrmacht, convinced she was serving a righteous cause. Now, stripped of that certainty, she clutched a small brass compass her father had given her before she left Stuttgart. It no longer pointed toward anything she recognized as home. The women descended from the truck in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms dirty and torn from weeks of transit through France and across the Atlantic. They had been told to expect brutality, starvation, perhaps worse. The propaganda had been clear. Americans showed no mercy to captured Germans, especially women who had dared to serve in military capacities. Margaret steeled herself for whatever horrors awaited them behind the chain-link fences of this prisoner of war facility. Captain Robert Morrison stood waiting at the processing center, a clipboard in his hands and an expression that confused Margaret completely. He looked tired, yes, but not cruel, not hateful. He was perhaps 35, with graying temples and eyes that seemed more weary than angry. When he spoke, his voice carried authority but not menace. "You will be processed, assigned barracks, and given uniforms and basic necessities. You will follow camp rules. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention." His words were translated by a German-speaking corporal, but Margaret understood enough English to catch his tone. It was professional, almost gentle. Frida Becker, standing beside Margaret, whispered in German, "It's a trick. They want us to relax before they show their true nature." Frida was 24, had worked in supply coordination, and possessed a cynicism that had only deepened since their capture. But Margaret wasn't so sure. She had seen the American soldiers' faces as they unloaded the truck. Some had looked curious, others indifferent, but none had shown the sadistic pleasure the propaganda had promised. The barracks were crude but clean. Each woman received 2 blankets, a pillow, and basic toiletries. The portions at dinner that first night were small but adequate. Bread, soup, some kind of meat Margaret couldn't identify. It wasn't abundance, but it wasn't starvation either. As she lay on her narrow cot that first night, listening to the quiet sobbing of younger prisoners who missed their families, Margaret found herself more unsettled by the lack of cruelty than she would have been by its presence. Everything she had been taught was already beginning to crack, and they had only been here for hours. What else had been lies? The first week at Camp Shanks passed in a blur of routines and regulations. Wake at 600 hours, roll call, breakfast, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, lights out at 2100 hours. The German women moved through these rhythms mechanically, keeping to themselves, speaking only in hushed German during meals. They had been assigned various duties, kitchen work, laundry, groundskeeping, and they performed them with the same military precision they had once brought to serving the Reich. But Margaret noticed things that didn't align with what she had expected. The guards were young, mostly farm boys and small-town Americans who seemed uncomfortable with their roles as jailers. They didn't shout or threaten. They made awkward attempts at basic German phrases, mispronouncing simple words in ways that would have been funny if the situation weren't so strange. Private James Wilson, a lanky soldier from somewhere called Nebraska, had even smiled at her once when she correctly sorted a pile of supply requisitions. From their barracks, the women could see beyond the fence to the small town of Orangeburg. It was nothing like the shattered cities they had left behind in Europe. Houses stood intact, painted in colors that seemed absurdly cheerful. Children rode bicycles down peaceful streets. Women pushed baby carriages and stopped to chat with neighbors. On Sunday mornings, church bells rang and families walked together in their finest clothes. The normalcy of it was almost offensive. "Look at them," Helga Schneider muttered one afternoon as they hung laundry on clotheslines near the fence. She was 20 years old, the youngest of their group, and had served as an auxiliary nurse. They don't even know there's a war happening. They're having picnics while Europe burns. But Margaret heard something else in Helga's voice, not just anger, but longing. The girl watched those American children with an expression that revealed how much she had lost. One evening in late April, something unexpected happened. Private Wilson approached Margaret as she swept the administrative building steps. He carried something folded under his arm. Without meeting her eyes directly, he set down 2 extra blankets beside her broom. "Gets cold at night still," he said in his awkward Midwestern accented English. Then he walked away before she could respond. Margaret stood frozen, staring at the blankets. This wasn't procedure, this was kindness. Voluntary, unnecessary kindness from an enemy soldier to a prisoner. She picked up the blankets slowly, feeling their weight in her arms. They were thick, clean, and warm. That night, she shared one with Frida, and as they lay in the darkness, Frida whispered, "Maybe they're trying to make us soft before they turn cruel." But Margaret didn't answer. She was too busy remembering the way Private Wilson had looked embarrassed by his own generosity, as if kindness were something to be ashamed of. May arrived with unexpected warmth, bringing cherry blossoms to the trees that lined the camp's perimeter. The German women had settled into a cautious routine, no longer expecting brutality but not yet trusting the strange gentleness of their captivity. They worked, they ate, they slept. They existed in a liminal space between war and peace, between enemy and something they had no words for. Then came the morning that changed everything. Captain Morrison called an assembly in the main yard, and the women gathered with the usual mixture of anxiety and resignation that accompanied any official announcement. Margaret stood between Frida and Helga, her hands clasped behind her back in military posture. Whatever was coming, she would face it with dignity. What Captain Morrison announced was so unexpected that the translator had to repeat it twice before the women believed they had heard correctly. "The ladies of the Orangeburg Community Church have extended an invitation," the captain said, his voice careful and measured. "They would like to host a social gathering and have requested permission to include you as guests. This is entirely voluntary. Those who wish to attend will be escorted into town this Saturday evening." Silence fell over the assembled prisoners. Margaret felt Frida stiffen beside her. A social gathering? With American civilians? It made no sense. Prisoners of war didn't attend social gatherings with the enemy population. They certainly weren't invited as guests. This had to be some kind of test, or perhaps a cruel joke designed to humiliate them in front of the townspeople. "Why would they do this?" Helga whispered in German, her young face confused and frightened. "What do they want from us?" It was the question on everyone's mind. In their experience, nothing came without a price, especially not kindness from enemies. There had to be an ulterior motive, some propaganda purpose they couldn't yet see. That evening, in the barracks, the debate raged in hushed German conversations. Some women absolutely refused to consider attending. "It's a trap," insisted Frida, pacing between the rows of cots. "They'll parade us through town like animals in a zoo, or worse, they'll use us to prove something to their newspapers about how generous Americans are to their prisoners." Others were simply too frightened. The thought of leaving the relative safety of the camp, of being surrounded by American civilians whose sons and husbands were fighting and dying against Germany, was terrifying. But Margaret found herself strangely curious. She thought about Private Wilson's blankets, about the guards who stumbled through German phrases, about the children beyond the fence who played without fear. What kind of people were these Americans? And what kind of social gathering would include enemy prisoners as guests? Against all her training, all her instincts for self-preservation, she found herself wanting to know the answer. "I'm going," she announced quietly that night. Frida stared at her as if she had gone mad. Saturday evening arrived with a golden sunset. that painted the camp in shades of amber and rose. 17 German women had chosen to attend the gathering, including Margaret, Frida, and Helga. They dressed in their cleanest auxiliary uniforms, brushed their hair until it shined, and stood in nervous formation near the gate. Captain Morrison and 4 guards would escort them, but he had made it clear they were attending as guests, not as prisoners under heavy watch. The distinction felt both meaningful and terrifying. The walk into Orangeburg took only 15 minutes, but it felt like crossing into another world. The town hall stood at the center of Main Street, a modest white building with tall windows that glowed with warm light. As they approached, Margaret could hear music drifting from inside, something with piano and violins, cheerful and bright. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Through the windows, she could see dozens of American civilians, women mostly, arranging tables covered in white cloths and setting out plates of food. When they entered, a hush fell over the room. The German women clustered together near the doorway, their military bearing the only shield they had against the scrutiny of these enemy eyes. But then a stout woman with gray hair and a warm smile stepped forward, her hands outstretched in welcome. "Girls, we're so glad you could come," she said, and the translator conveyed her words with careful precision. "I'm Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, and we've prepared a little celebration for spring. Please make yourselves comfortable." The evening unfolded like a dream that Margaret kept expecting to become a nightmare. The American women didn't stare with hatred or disgust. They smiled. They offered seats. They brought plates laden with foods the Germans had almost forgotten existed. Small sandwiches cut into triangles, cookies with chocolate chips, fresh fruit that seemed impossibly abundant. And then came the moment that would become seared into Margaret's memory forever. Mrs. Patterson approached, carrying a tray of tall glasses filled with dark liquid, topped with enormous scoops of white cream. The glasses sparkled in the light, bubbles rising through the mysterious brown liquid like tiny jewels. She set them before Margaret and Frida with a proud smile. "Root beer floats," she announced. "A special American treat. We thought you girls might enjoy something sweet." Margaret stared at the glass before her. She had never seen anything like it. The effervescence, the extravagant cream, the careful presentation, it looked like celebration itself poured into glass. Beside her, Frida whispered in stunned German, "Is this champagne?" Her voice carried genuine wonder. They had been told Americans were suffering, that their country was running out of resources, that the war had impoverished them. Yet here was luxury, offered casually to enemy prisoners as if it were nothing special. Margaret lifted the glass, with trembling hands, watching the bubbles dance. If this was propaganda, it was the most elaborate and expensive propaganda she had ever encountered. The glass felt cold against her palms, real and solid and utterly bewildering. Frida raised her glass first, her eyes meeting Margaret's with an expression that mixed defiance and desperate hope. If this was champagne, if the Americans were celebrating something with them rather than over them, perhaps it meant something. Perhaps it meant they were seen as human beings rather than enemy vermin. She brought the glass to her lips and took a long sip, expecting the familiar sharp effervescence of champagne, the sophisticated burn of alcohol that she remembered from better days in Cologne. Her face contorted immediately. The expression was so dramatic, so utterly confused, that several American women noticed and began to laugh. Not cruel laughter, but the gentle amusement of people watching someone discover something unexpected. Frida's eyes went wide, her mouth puckering, as if she had bitten into something both sweet and deeply strange. She lowered the glass slowly, staring at it with betrayal written across her features. "This is not champagne," she said in German, her voice carrying a mixture of disappointment and wonder. "This is something else entirely, something very sweet and very bizarre." She looked at Margaret with an expression that seemed to contain their entire journey from Germany to this moment, all the certainty they had lost, all the assumptions that had crumbled. "I don't understand what this is," Margaret took her own tentative sip. The flavor exploded across her tongue, intensely sweet, strange, unlike anything she had ever tasted. There was something medicinal about it, something that reminded her vaguely of the root extracts her grandmother had used in folk remedies. But mixed with the cream, the cold sweetness, it became something altogether new. It wasn't sophisticated or elegant. It was innocent, almost childish in its straightforward pleasure. It was so profoundly American that she almost laughed. Mrs. Patterson noticed their confusion and approached with a kind smile. "Not what you expected?" she asked through the translator. "Root beer is made from sassafras and other roots. It's an old American drink. We add vanilla ice cream to make it special. Nothing alcoholic, just something sweet for a spring evening." She paused, her eyes softening. "I thought you girls might need something sweet after everything you've been through." The simple kindness of that statement hit Margaret harder than any champagne could have. This wasn't a celebration of victory over defeated enemies. This was comfort, offered freely to young women who were far from home and frightened. Mrs. Patterson saw them not as Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps members or Nazi prisoners, but as girls who might need something sweet. The distinction shattered something inside Margaret's chest. She took another sip, letting the strange sweetness fill her mouth. This time she tasted it differently, not as a failed expectation of champagne, but as exactly what it was, a root beer float, an American invention that made no sense to her German sensibilities but somehow contained more genuine welcome than any formal greeting could have offered. Around her, other German women were having the same revelation, their faces moving from confusion to tentative appreciation. Helga actually smiled, a real smile, for the first time since their capture. The root beer float evening became a turning point that none of the German women could have anticipated. In the days that followed, the tension in Camp Shanks shifted subtly but unmistakably. The prisoners no longer avoided eye contact with the guards. Conversations began to happen in broken English and patient German, with hand gestures filling the gaps that language couldn't bridge. Private Wilson brought Margaret an English-German dictionary he had ordered from a bookstore in New York City. She accepted it with a gratitude that felt almost painful in its intensity. But 2 weeks after the social gathering, reality crashed back into their tentative peace with devastating force. The mail delivery arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in late May, and with it came letters from the International Red Cross. Not all the women received correspondence, but those who did gathered in small clusters, their faces pale as they read news from home. Margaret's letter came from a Red Cross worker in Stuttgart, not from her family. Her hands shook as she unfolded the thin paper. The words were clinical, bureaucratic, in their delivery of catastrophe. Her family's apartment building had been destroyed in an Allied bombing raid in February. Her mother and younger sister were confirmed dead. Her father's status was unknown, last seen in the chaos of refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. The Red Cross worker expressed sympathy and noted that she should prepare for the probability that she had no family left to return to in Germany. Margaret read the letter 3 times before the meaning fully penetrated. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket, and walked to the latrine where she could be alone. She sat on the cold concrete floor and did not cry. She had no tears left for losses this enormous. Instead, she felt a strange numbness, as if her body had decided that feeling this pain would destroy her, so it simply refused to process it at all. Frida found her there an hour later. Frida's own letter had brought different but equally devastating news. Cologne was rubble. Her fiancé, a Luftwaffe pilot, was confirmed killed in action over France. Her parents had survived but were living in a displaced persons camp with no home, no possessions, no future she could identify. The two women sat side by side on the cold floor, not speaking, their shoulders barely touching in a gesture of shared grief that transcended words. But the most shocking news came from another source entirely. That same week, American newspapers began arriving at the camp with stories that Captain Morrison felt the German prisoners needed to see. Photographs from liberated concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, places that Margareta had never heard of, atrocities she had never imagined possible. The images were grainy, but clear enough. The descriptions were detailed and horrifying. The systematic murder of millions. The deliberate bureaucratic genocide that had been carried out in the name of the Reich she had served. Margaret sat in the camp library, a newspaper spread before her, and felt her entire understanding of reality collapse. She thought of that root beer float, its innocent sweetness. She thought of Mrs. Patterson's kindness, and she realized with crushing clarity that she had been serving monsters while believing herself a patriot. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was officially over. In Camp Shanks, the American soldiers celebrated with restrained relief rather than wild jubilation. They knew that men were still dying in the Pacific, that the war was only half won. But for the German women prisoners, the announcement brought something more complicated than either celebration or mourning. It brought the question they had been dreading: what happens to us now? Captain Morrison called another assembly 3 days after the victory announcement. The repatriation procedures would begin within the month, he explained. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes in Germany. Transportation would be arranged. The International Red Cross would assist in locating surviving family members. Everything would be done in accordance with proper protocols and international agreements. His words were professional, correct, and utterly terrifying to many of the women listening. That night, the barracks filled with whispered conversations that lasted until dawn. What did they have to return to? Margaret lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Stuttgart in ruins and parents who were almost certainly dead. She thought about the Germany described in those newspapers, the one that had built factories of death while people like her went about their duties, never questioning, never looking too closely at what was being done in their name. How could she return to that? How could she help rebuild a country whose very foundation was soaked in innocent blood? Frida sat on the edge of her bunk, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "My aunt lives in New York City," she said suddenly. "She emigrated in 1933 when she saw what was coming. She was the smart one in the family. She saw the truth before the rest of us." Frida paused, and Margaret could hear the catch in her throat. "She sent me a letter through the Red Cross. She said I could come stay with her if I wanted, if they would let me. She said America gives second chances to people who are willing to change." The words hung in the air like a fragile hope, dangerous to even consider. Prisoners of war didn't just stay in the enemy country, they went home. That was how it worked. But as Margaret lay there, she thought about that root beer float, about Mrs. Patterson's kindness, about Private Wilson's embarrassed generosity with the blankets. She thought about a country that had abundance to spare, even in wartime, that invited enemy prisoners to social gatherings, that treated young women who had served the Wehrmacht with more dignity than the Wehrmacht had shown to its own victims. "I don't want to go back," Helga whispered from across the room. She was crying, her young voice breaking with the admission. "I have nothing there, no family left, no home, just ruins and guilt, and people who will hate me for surviving when so many died." She took a shuddering breath. "Here, they gave us root beer floats. There, they'll give us nothing but blame." The decision took shape slowly, built from countless midnight conversations and careful observations of the world beyond the camp fence. Margaret began documenting everything in a small notebook that Private Wilson had given her. She wrote down the names of the women who were considering staying, their reasons, their fears. She practiced English phrases until her pronunciation improved. She read American newspapers voraciously, trying to understand this country that had defeated hers but offered sweetness instead of vengeance. By mid-June, 7 women had made their choice. Margaret, Frida, and Helga formed the core of the group, but they were joined by 4 others. Christina Adler, a former supply clerk from Berlin whose entire family had perished. Elsa Bauer, a radio operator from Munich who had distant cousins in Chicago. Gisela Hoffmann, a medic from Frankfurt who saw no future in returning to practice medicine in destroyed hospitals. And Sophie Werner, a young woman from Dusseldorf whose fiancé had been executed for participating in the July 20th plot against Hitler. Each had her own reasons, her own losses, her own desperate hope for redemption. The process of requesting to stay was more complicated than any of them had imagined. Captain Morrison listened to their request with a mixture of surprise and sympathy, but he explained that this fell outside normal repatriation procedures. He would need to contact his superiors, who would need to contact officials in Washington, who would need to consult with immigration authorities and the State Department. The women might be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war, which would open different legal pathways, but also remove the protections of the Geneva Convention. "I need you to understand what you're asking for," Captain Morrison said, meeting each woman's eyes in turn. The translator conveyed his words with careful precision. "If you stay, you'll need sponsors, American citizens who will vouch for you, provide housing, help you find employment. You'll need to learn English fluently. You'll need to prove that you're not security risks, that you've genuinely rejected Nazi ideology. Some Americans will never forgive you for being German. You'll face prejudice, suspicion, and hostility. Are you certain this is what you want?" Margaret stood, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Captain, we have nothing to return to except ruins and guilt. Here, people have shown us that former enemies can become something else. We want the chance to prove that we can be worthy of that generosity. We want to become Americans, if America will have us." The other 6 women nodded, their faces reflecting the same desperate determination. What happened next surprised everyone. When word spread through Orangeburg that 7 German prisoners were requesting to stay, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. Mrs. Patterson immediately offered to sponsor Margaret, providing a room in her home and a job helping at her husband's pharmacy. Frida's aunt secured sponsorship papers from New York. Local families stepped forward for the others, moved by their story and their obvious sincerity. The same town that had served them root beer floats now offered them futures. The transition from prisoner of war to displaced person happened with bureaucratic slowness but irreversible momentum. By August 1945, the paperwork had been processed, sponsors had been approved, and the 7 German women who chose to stay were released from Camp Shanks into a new kind of uncertainty. They were no longer prisoners, but they weren't quite citizens either. They existed in a liminal space, German by birth, but American by choice, belonging fully to neither world, but desperately trying to build bridges between them. Margaret moved into Mrs. Patterson's guest bedroom on a humid afternoon in late August. The room was small but spotlessly clean, with flowered curtains and a quilt that Mrs. Patterson's grandmother had sewn decades earlier. After months of institutional barracks, the privacy felt almost overwhelming. That first night, Margaret lay in the soft bed and cried quietly, mourning everything she had lost while simultaneously feeling grateful for everything she was being given. The contradictions also exhausted her. Working at Patterson's pharmacy proved both easier and harder than she had anticipated. Her English improved rapidly through daily interactions with customers, though her accent marked her immediately as foreign. Some customers were kind, patient with her linguistic stumbles, and curious about her story. Others were coldly hostile, their sons or husbands having died fighting against Germany. One elderly woman actually spat at Margaret's feet and called her a Nazi murderer before Mr. Patterson gently escorted her from the store. Margaret stood frozen behind the counter, shame burning through her chest. understanding that this was part of the price she would pay for the rest of her life. But there were unexpected moments of grace that sustained her. A young mother whose brother had been killed at Normandy came in regularly for baby formula and always made a point of speaking kindly to Margaret. "My brother wouldn't want me to hate you," she said once, adjusting her infant daughter on her hip. "He used to say that German soldiers were just boys like him, caught up in something bigger than any of them understood. I figure German girls probably aren't much different." The words were a gift that Margaret treasured for weeks afterward. Frida's transition in New York City was different, but equally challenging. Her aunt found her work as a seamstress in the garment district, where she spent long days at a sewing machine alongside women from a dozen different countries. The immigrant community there was more accepting, everyone understanding what it meant to be displaced and trying to build new lives in America. But Frida struggled with the loneliness of the massive city, the way you could be surrounded by millions of people and still feel completely alone. Helga found her calling in an unexpected place. A local elementary school needed a teacher's aide, and despite her youth and limited English, the principal saw something in her gentle manner with children. She began working with the youngest students, teaching them basic German phrases while they helped her master English. The children didn't care that she had been an enemy prisoner. They just knew that Miss Helga told wonderful stories and always had time to bandage scraped knees. May 15, 1970. Margaret Klein Patterson stood in the parking lot of what had once been Camp Shanks, now converted into veterans housing and community buildings. She was 47 years old, an American citizen for 2 decades, mother of 3 children who had never known war. Her hair showed threads of silver, and her face carried lines that spoke of both hardship and laughter. Beside her stood her husband, Thomas Patterson, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's nephew, whom she had married in 1948. In her hands, she carried a large cooler filled with ice and bottles of root beer, and containers of vanilla ice cream that were already beginning to soften in the spring warmth. The reunion had been planned for months. Of the 7 women who had stayed, 5 were still alive and able to attend. Frida had become Frida Morrison after marrying Private James Wilson in a ceremony that made local newspapers. She now lived in Nebraska with 4 children and a successful catering business. Helga had earned her teaching certificate and was now a beloved principal at an elementary school in Connecticut. Christina ran a bakery in Boston. Else had returned to Germany in 1955, unable to fully reconcile her American dream with her German heart. But she had come back to America for this gathering. Captain Morrison, now a retired colonel with white hair and a cane, had organized the reunion. He stood near the entrance to what had been the camp's main hall, greeting former prisoners and former guards with equal warmth. Private Wilson, Frida's husband, helped set up tables and chairs, joking that he was still taking orders from German women after all these years. The comment made everyone laugh, the kind of laughter that comes from shared history and hard-won understanding. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Margaret began preparing the root beer floats. She poured the fizzing liquid into tall glasses with the practiced ease of someone who had made thousands of them over the years. She added generous scoops of vanilla ice cream, watching the foam rise to the rim of each glass. Her children helped distribute them to the assembled guests, former prisoners, former guards, townspeople who had offered kindness 25 years earlier, and younger people who had come to hear stories of transformation and redemption. When everyone held a glass, Margaret stood to speak. Her English was flawless now, with only the slightest trace of German accent that surfaced on certain words. 25 years ago, she began, her voice carrying across the assembled group, I took my first sip of a root beer float in the Orangeburg Town Hall. I thought it was champagne. I thought Americans were celebrating their victory over us. She paused, looking around at the faces watching her. But I was wrong about everything. It wasn't champagne. It was something much more valuable. It was welcome. It was kindness offered to enemies. It was the taste of second chances. She raised her glass, and 40 people raised theirs in response. To root beer floats, she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. And to the Americans who taught us that former enemies can become family.